Okay, great. So then why don't we begin with our blessing for studying Torah and immersing ourselves in words of Torah. Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידע-די-די-די-די-די, 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 yada-di-di-di-di. So this week's Torah portion is Acharimot Kedoshim, and we're focusing on the second part of the Torah portion, the Kedoshim part, and it is the middle of the book of Leviticus. The chapter 19 in Leviticus is often referred to as the Holiness Code because it includes a list of laws and rules that we are asked to follow in order to be holy. The words are, and you shall be holy, that kind of sandwich in these verses called the Holiness Code. And today, I want to focus on only one. We know that there's several that are listed here. And actually in our text study, I think I end up bringing in 3, but the focus is really just one of them. So I'm going to share the screen with all of you. In just a second, it moved it around when I started sharing on social media. So let me just fix that quickly. Okay. And essentially, this particular verse that we're going to be focusing on is a verse that talks about bias, specifically in a court of law, but it could be applied to many other circumstances. And with everything that's gone on this week, it felt like an appropriate text to bring in. So, okay. The word Kedoshim here, the name of the Torah portion, it also comes from the Hebrew word kadosh, which means holiness, after the Holiness Code and the words that appear within. So I want to start just for this little section from Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, as a start into talking about racial bias and how it might factor into things. So would anyone like to read this first paragraph from the book?
Ken.
Thanks, Ray. Are you volunteering?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I was co-leading a workshop with an African-American man. A white participant said to him, "I don't see race. I don't see you as Black." My co-trainer's response was, "Then how will you see racism?" He then explained to her that he was Black. He was confident that she would see, he then explained to her that he was Black. He was confident that she would see this and that his race meant that he had a very different experience in life than she did. If she were ever going to understand or challenge racism, she would need to acknowledge this difference, pretending that she did not notice that he was Black. He was not helpful to him in any way, as it denied his reality. Indeed, it refused his reality and kept hers insular and unchallenged. This pretense that she did not notice his race assumed that he was just like her, and in so doing, she projected her reality onto him. For example, "I feel welcome at work, so you must too. I have never felt that my race mattered, so you must feel that yours doesn't either." But of course, we do see the race of other people, and race holds deep social meaning for us. To continue reproducing racial inequality, the system only needs for white people to be really nice and carry on, to smile at people of color, to go to lunch with them on occasion. To be clear, being nice is generally a better policy than being mean, but niceness does not bring racism to the table and will not keep it on the table when so many of us who are white want it off. Niceness does not break with white solidarity and white silence. In fact, naming racism is often seen as not nice, triggering white fragility.
Okay, so I know that's a big text to start this with, and we really are diving in. I'm just kind of curious, any responses to this text? I see some deep breaths going on here. Not quite sure what to make of it. That's okay.
I think it's a more common lesson, at least it has been in my life, because I had to learn this. I had to learn to see and acknowledge that a person looked a certain way, in this case, Black skin, because I thought, because I was raised in a certain way, that ignoring that was the polite, right, moral thing to do. So this lesson that this person is sharing is one that is recent in my life, and is also I've heard more frequently. And so I've come to respect it and understand it far more than I did in the very beginning.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're absolutely right. There was this idea that children should be raised to not see race, that equality was seeing everyone as exactly the same. And it came from the best possible intentions, right? But the consequence of it is, as Robin DiAngelo was trying to explain here, that people then can feel invisible, as if their race, their culture, their background doesn't matter and shouldn't be talked about. And that wasn't the intention of that at all, right? So thank you for bringing that in.
I can add a little something to that from
Yeah.
a very personal experience. Two things, really. Just to confirm what was just stated, I can remember as a child looking out the window and seeing the trash truck come down the street. And I was only about 4 or 5 years old. And I mentioned to my mom, look, that man is Black. And she said, oh, you mustn't say things like that. You mustn't say things like that because he would get mad. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing, but to me, it was just an observation. I mean, it's the first time I had seen a person who had Black skin. The other thing is my daughter married a Black man. And that was something really to think about. My wife could not handle it. She did not want anything to do with him. She eventually overcame that. But in a very real way, the difference came to the forefront when my daughter, and they had a son, and the man, her husband, they were going to go camping in northern Michigan. Well, my experience with northern Michigan was there were a lot of rednecks up there, and it was pretty racist. And I didn't think a couple, a mixed marriage, mixed race couple showing up camping, you might run into somebody who really had some objections to that. So I wondered, how do I warn them? This is not a good idea. And it started me thinking about the fact that, well, even though I made nice with the fellow, and I like him, he's a nice guy, I really don't hold anything against him, that other people might really see things a very different way to their detriment. So it's just something that you have to reconcile yourself to and eventually really see the difference.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so much that you just said, Jim, right? Like starting from your very first comment of saying, hey, there's a Black man that's outside, right? And the question, of course, is if you had said, hey, there's a white guy outside, would the reaction have been the same? And it might not have been, right? And why would that be? And when we're looking at race, like, yeah, there is this really important kind of understanding that people who have dark skin, people who are in an interracial relationship could be met with a kind of anger toward them that isn't fair and isn't right, but is the reality. So thank you for bringing all of that in.
I've been go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
I've been reading this book, White Fragility by D'Angelo. And the one thing that bothered me about the book was that her contention is that we as whites cannot understand the reaction of a black person or a person of color because we aren't people of color. And yet she is white. And then she proceeded to tell me what I couldn't understand. And that tended to bother me. I agree with a lot of what she said, but I still had this in the back of my mind that here is a white person telling me that as a white person, I can't understand what she's telling me. And so it bothered me.
Oxymoron.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't read the book, but from a cultural point of view, we as Jews could and should be able to identify easily because, of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism that goes on to this very day. And so even though we're not black, we're discriminated against by certain parts of the society. And I was going to also say, and I apologize if I've mentioned it in previous settings, but my parents were really wonderful and kind and sweet people, but there was in this neighborhood that we lived in, which was primarily Jewish in this borough of Queens, New York, there were no African Americans. And my father had one working down in his place of business, and he was a very lovely man. But the point I'm going to make is that there was a certain fear that my mother or my father expressed that of African Americans, that maybe they were maybe they robbed and they did things that were, anyway, it was a certain fear instilled in me, but that fear completely left me, and it never came back when I was in dental school and I did a course called Gross Anatomy, where you dissect human beings. And with a group of 3 others on my table, we had an African American woman, and there were many of them in our class who got dissected. And when you go just right below the skin, we're all human beings and everything looks the same. There is no differences in the organs and the muscles and whatever. So that's when whatever fears that were instilled or concerns by parents of that generation left me when I studied gross anatomy in dental school at NYU.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to recognize too. I think our society focuses a lot on individual, right? And when we talk about racism, it's systemic, right? It's all around us in so many ways. It's built into the fabric of the greater culture. And so it can be hard to even see. And so, yeah, you can have good people who have racist thoughts. In fact, I believe that all of us have some racist thoughts, right? The question is, do we acknowledge them and move against them? Do we do something to combat them? I mean, I've said before, there are moments like in New York, especially where walking down the street late at night, I see 3 Black men walking on one side of the street and I'd go to the other side. Why? Like, why am I doing that? It's because there's something in me that's telling me they're not safe, and color of their skin had something to do with it. I'm not proud of that, but that definitely exists within me. And I think the more that we can recognize that exists in greater culture and maybe even within ourselves because of what we've been exposed to, the better off we are to combat it. But that's what this is bringing in.
Do you think we as Jews, because of our history, are super sensitive to ethnicity and race?
I definitely think so, right? Like, we know what it is to be persecuted or put down or to have family members killed because of religion. We know what it is to be fearful, right? So we can definitely relate on that level. However, for those of us who have light colored skin, we have a kind of privilege in this country that we can walk outside and blend in with everyone, right?
Yeah,
In a way that someone of color can't. Like, we can go outside and wear a kippah and everyone knows we're Jewish, but we could take that kippah off and no one necessarily knows that we're Jewish.
I was having this conversation with a friend the other day about being white, being blonde, you know, with blue eyes, and talking about how the police have treated us and other people in general, being so helpful and so forth. You know, and I remember once or twice being stopped, you know, maybe I didn't make a complete stop, you know, at an intersection, and a policeman stopping me, and he said, well, you know, I said, I don't know what I said. I did stop, but not, you know, completely. And he said, well, I'll just give you a warning. You know, I'll just give you a warning. And that may have happened twice, you know. I mean, any interaction always has been so positive. And my friend and I were saying, we are definitely privileged. This is not the way they behave, you know, towards people of color. And so I've always appreciated it as privilege, but in a way it really bothers you. It bothers you that that should be the case. And I think for me, you know, I am a child of Holocaust survivors. And so I've always been very, you know, sensitive to issues of prejudice and racism and all of that. But I think you're really right in saying that even so, you know, if I would see, you're right, at night, a couple of black guys, I would cross the street too. And why? So it's in recent years that I've taken upon myself to really educate myself and to feel, you know, I can't walk in their shoes, but to really try. And I think one thing that really influenced me tremendously was reading Becoming by Michelle Obama. And I really understood what it's like to grow up in America being Black. You know, so it gave me a greater understanding. So there's always room for growth, you know, which I'm trying to say. You may think you're very liberal and so forth, but there are issues underneath that we, you know, we still have, you know, that we need to work through. Anyhow, so.
But not to make too light of it, if I were in New York and I saw a group of 3 white guys on the same side of the street, I think I would cross the street. Not to make a joke about it, but it would just seem, I would be starting to wonder what is on their minds. But in a more serious vein, there was a movie a couple of years ago, many years ago, in fact, Black Like Me, that a fellow who was white interacted in various parts of society, and you got to see the reaction. And then he made himself up with some liver pills or something that really darkened his skin. And this treatment by the same people was horrible. And I don't know if it was an exaggeration, but it really opened my eyes to the fact that in some parts of the country, people have a very different feeling than I grew up with in Los Angeles. And I really started to wonder why that was.
James Whitmore played the lead. I remember it well in high school, when we were in high school.
There was a Gregory Peck movie with the same theme, but he didn't do it black and stuff. But my experience is I lived in 2 different cultures, about as alien as you can get one from another, because in the military I moved to Georgia and I met and married a girl from Alabama who lived in Georgia. And one of the elements we haven't discussed is class, but it not only not only skin color, but class plays a big difference in society. Mm-hmm. And you know, where like Michael, I grew up in Brooklyn, not Queens, but there was plenty of anti-Black feelings. In the South, it was, you know, a mixed marriage in where I was in the 50s was when a Methodist married a Baptist. You know,
Sure.
And so, but my mother-in-law, who grew up in the Depression, she was not prejudiced in the sense that she would ever do anything to harm a person of color or even be ugly to a person of color. But she felt that they belonged in one place and white people belonged in another. So had she been living today, she would have evolved as most of us are. But there's also, a lot of Jewish people helped in the early stages of the NAACP and organizations like that, fought for civil rights. My rabbi marched Selma at that time, and it was a lot of Jewish support. And then there was some backlash, and there's also anti-Semitism in the Black community, and that's in the press. When a Hasidic ran over a Black boy in Borough Park or one of the neighborhoods, and it all came. So, but the point I'm trying to make, it's not only skin color, it's class.
Yeah. And that's exactly, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. So if someone knocked on your door, whether it's Black or white, you could tell by the way they were dressed, the way they spoke, what class they belonged in, and how would you treat that person, consciously or unconsciously.
Right. And that's really important to keep in mind, the consciously or unconsciously, right? And these texts that we're about to get to right now, they talk to class. They're not talking about race here, but they're talking about bigger themes, and class specifically comes into play. Would anyone like to read Leviticus 19:15 in the English?
I can read it.
Thank you, Sari.
You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly.
Okay. And that sounds good, right? But it can be really complicated. We know that, right? Just look at our judicial system. People who have money can hire great lawyers.
Yeah.
People who don't, well, we know the kind of justice that sometimes exists or lack thereof, that can just sit in jails for long periods of time because they can't afford to pay meager fees or because they just don't have someone at their disposal to help them through their case. We know how difficult that is. So there's a couple of texts here. This is Rashi commentary based on 1915. And you can see that these two comments that I'm bringing in, I can't fully fit them on the page, but that's fairly close. They're the two sides of the verse. So I don't really like the wording of Rashi. I took it directly from Sefaria translation. If you look at the Hebrew here, it says lo tisa pnei dal. What that means is don't lift up the face of someone who is poor, meaning don't show specific favoritism to someone just because they are poor. And the same thing down here below, lo tadar pnei dal. Don't honor the face of someone who is mighty. Gadol, who is great, has a higher status basically within the community. These two things are purposefully mirroring one another here in Rashi's comments. So the first one, you shall not say this is a poor man and the rich man has in any case the duty of supporting him. I will find in favor of him, the poor man, and he will consequently obtain some of the support in a respectable fashion. So you don't just side with someone because they are of a lower status. And the same thing here, don't say this is a rich man or this man is of noble descent. How can I possibly put him into shame and be witness to his shame? There is punishment for such a thing. It is for this reason that the scripture states, thou shalt not honor the person of the mighty. So there could be a bias towards someone because they are of a lower class status and someone because they were of a higher one. But the text is trying to teach us, no, don't lean into that bias. Judge fairly based on the circumstances before you. There's a couple of other texts that lean to this as well. So does anyone want to read this text from the Talmud, which is a 4th, 5th century text?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. And then Sandy, I'd love for you to read the next one.
Appointing a judge who is biased or ill prepared for the role is considered so bad that it is considered akin to one of the greatest sins in the Jewish tradition. It teaches in the name of the sage, Reish Lakish, anyone who appoints a judge who is unfit for the position due to his lack of knowledge or wickedness is considered as though he plants idolatry among the Jewish people.
It's a
Pretty
pretty
strong.
strong statement. Yeah, exactly, Steve.
Is that the Supreme Court?
Oh.
And they didn't quite have the Supreme Court. Maybe the Sanhedrin, but not the Supreme Court. What do you think of that comparison, though, to planting idolatry with not being fit to make a fair judgment?
It's rather presumptuous, I think.
So say more, Shelley.
Well, that I don't think one necessarily has to do with the other. It's jumping to a conclusion.
Well, I don't think it's saying that they have anything to do with one another. It's just saying that it is that bad, right? Idolatry is one of the unforgivable kind of sins.
It's a metaphor,
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts here?
As I was reading it, the thing that came into my head was taking the role of judge, also interpreting it sort of as a leader, and how sometimes our leaders are not fit to be, they don't understand what's going on, or they're not knowledgeable enough to understand what's going on. And we've lived through that a lot the last couple of years, and I think it's just
Especially the last few months.
interesting that we that they really that the Torah, the Talmud really understood this long time ago, something that is happening as we speak.
And it could be leaders on any level, right? That if someone doesn't fully understand the kind of bias that's existing and is operating off of their own bias, whatever it is, the consequences for that are enormous. And so there's a lot of responsibility that's laid on leaders and judges here. I think that's really important to point out. Thank you, Jay.
But there's a difference between appointing and electing.
That's right.
There certainly is. How does that relate to this particular teaching?
Well, it says appointing a judge, which means that he was not elected by the masses of the people, that it was appointed by someone. Whereas electing, when we elect someone, I think we get what we deserve. I think when you appoint somebody, you rely on the ability of whoever is doing that appointing to pick someone of value.
Fade it out at the end.
It's hard to hear you right now, Michael. You
Can't hear you.
a little bit.
Okay.
We got the most of that, but you were just distinguishing that if it's appointed, then it's more controlled, right? And if it's electing, then more people have a say in it.
Exactly.
So,
Electing should be the masses of the people's decision, where appointing tends to be more someone that does the appointing.
right.
Which do you favor? I mean, which system do you favor, election or appointment?
I think it's 6 of one and half a dozen of another, really. I don't personally have that much confidence in the intelligence of the electorate or the ability to decide who is good and who is bad. And that may also apply to an individual or a group of people who do appointing. Perhaps you have to rely on their intelligence and their integrity to appoint the proper person.
Right. I mean, I think the key teaching here, though, is really just the importance of having people in leadership positions who can truly appreciate the complexity and who can respond and judge from a place of understanding and fighting against that bias that is so naturally a part of our community and world.
I think also that it's like there's a culpability which is much broader than what is here. A judge is elected or appointed. The person who appoints him is elected or appointed. And so this is Jews teaching Jews. So we have to say, when that happens, it's idolatry among all of us, it reflects on all of us. All of us. And the fact that we are a tremendous minority, is that everything comes back on your house. One of the differences between us and people of color, those of us who are of a white background, is that we can pass. I can pass for being, many of us can, because I have such a mixed background. It's like, I'm not going to be mistreated because of the color of my skin very often. It does happen. I've always had friends who are Black. I do now. I appreciate it because they have a different point of view. And I've told people that it's part of the basis of that relationship is the ability to get to know people who aren't the same as you, to diversify points of view. And I work with people of actually quite a few different backgrounds. So it is, but I always know, because they know that I'm Rabbi Catherine, they look at me and they see Jew. And what does a Jew do? What do they not do? Oh, that's interesting. And we have that experience back and forth with each other. Oh, this is what happens with you and what happens with me. What's this day to you? What's this day to me? But it's once you're identified one way or another, it is huge. There was a point of time when I was took care of the house for a bunch of salesmen and rented the places where we lived. And we were a diverse group of people. And I will never forget that somebody rented one of those houses and everyone had to leave because of this one person, and how that one person who was Black felt. So when I went and rented places for us, I made sure that I specifically said to the person renting, we are a diverse group of people. Do you have a problem with that? I do not want the people with whom I live and work to be embarrassed, to be thought differently of, to be made to feel uncomfortable. And it was one of the ways of getting along really well with a diverse group of people. I keep saying, what if it was me? What if it was me? What if it was me? How can I make this better? And I am, by no means spectacular at it, but it's something I've been interested in for a very long time.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Catherine, for all of that. And I think many of us might have had experiences of times as Jews where we felt hatred, right? I know circumstances of a student in a congregation that I was serving who had to write a paper on how much percentage-wise of a fault the Holocaust was on God, on Nazis, and on the Jews. Like, how much was it the Jewish people's fault what happened in the Holocaust? What a terrible assignment and statement, right? Like, there are absolutely awful anti-Semitic kind of things that we as Jews have had to deal with. And we know what that feels like, to have someone in any sort of a position of power or leadership above us who's putting us in this incredibly unfair situation. And so I think that when we look at this Talmud text from Avodah Zarah, we can understand why that's so important, because we don't want any human being of any sexuality, of any race, of any culture, of any religion, anything, to feel targeted and demeaned as a human being because of the bias that that leader has. That can happen in so many ways, but I think that's a way where we can take our own experiences to try to start to understand the experiences of people who are different, who have different backgrounds than we do. So I want to bring in one more text here, and this is Rashi again. Rashi is always such a great source because he takes material from a bunch of other places and makes it in really easy kind of bite-sized chunks to play around with. So, in righteousness shall thou judge thy companion. Take this as the words imply. Take the word tzedek, or justice, as what it usually implies, strict right. And the word tzedek means like righteousness. That's what it's talking about here. Not right like the direction, right like righteousness. Another explanation is judge thy fellow man with an inclination in his favor. So there's a lot of different text about this. If someone does something, always try to look to the benefit of the doubt. What was his intention here? Try to give him the benefit of the doubt. When you then apply that to cases, that can get a little complicated, but that's the piece of it that he's trying to bring in. So I'm going to bring in another text here, and these are actually two different quotes from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Sandy, would you mind reading these for us, please?
Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. Racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them, inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the middle passage or trail of tears the way one deplores an earthquake, a tornado, or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of men. But race is the child of racism, not the father. The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemptive history. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine.
Okay, so I know there's some very, very strong statements here.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give anyone room to respond to them. Mike, are you saying something, or you're just kind of thinking? Because we can't hear you. You're on mute right now. That's why I was asking.
You know, the concept of black and white is an American concept. It originated in America. There was never like a black and white. You know, if you read Cass, you know, they talk more about that, which is really interesting to me. You know, that is the case, that we really originated that, you know, that concept.
Right, it's an American,
Yeah.
or it's a human idea. It's a manufactured idea.
Yes, yes.
And Ta-Nehisi Coates actually talks about that in his book as well, although slightly differently.
So we never evolved. You know, after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction where things were dramatically changing very fast. Then Lincoln was executed and Johnson took over, and all the positive things started to fade away. And then, of course, came Jim Crow, because the population in the South could not stand the fact that things were changing and that equality was on the rise. So we never had a full, I forget the term, they used it in South Africa, you know, we never had this phase where it was forgiven or anyway, I'm looking for words that are lost in my vocabulary right now. But we never went through that in this country. And they even though they were a large minority, they remained people with different colors. But they've been replaced with other minorities along the way that have had similar treatment. And it's almost like it's human nature. And I go back to my story on class, but I just have hope that the next generation, or each generation, the younger people seem to have a moderating attitude, and I think our kids and our grandkids are coming up with an even more progressive or open-mindedness, and are more used to the idea of getting along with other people, either class or color differences or religious differences. So.
Yeah, I want to agree with you, Irv, but I have some skepticism that that's true, because I think that racism in its earlier forms was really obvious, right? When you're enslaving people just because of the color of their skin, when people are being beaten and put in life-altering and life-threatening ways, the racism is quite apparent. But as time goes on, racism becomes far more sophisticated and sometimes masquerades as being for people's rights or people's personal freedoms when that is not the intention and that is not actually what's going on. So while I do believe that there's a lot of people and that our society is moving forward in some ways of being more accepting and celebrating some of our differences, I also believe that racism in some ways is becoming a lot more dangerous. So these two things are existing at the same time and require our diligence.
For me, it's a real moral issue. And I think that when we talk about our more recent history, that we tried to legislate morality by having the civil rights movement. And although I'm a supportive of that, and I'm supportive of the notion of getting into good trouble, as John Lewis said, and there's so many other quotes and things, Martin Luther King, all the rest, we still didn't do much with what's comes inside of us, our own spiritual morality, justice, views, and practices. So I think it's a process. I think that the Ta-Nehisi Coates and those folks, I love reading his stuff. They need to keep inspiring us and agitating us to get us to deal with this, what I consider to be a moral issue, and my responsibility in taking it on and fixing it.
Thank you, Marla. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do by any means.
If racism is a child of human nature, is it something that we can ever overcome?
I don't think it's easy.
The way I have come to understand this is that we're living in a modern society, and we've lived in an organized modern society for, say, a few hundred years. But our species has been on this planet for over 500,000 years. And for 90% of that time, we lived in little clans, either in caves or on the open savanna of Africa or in trees, where you were local to your own family or your own clan. And the clan that lived in the next series of caves down was your enemy, because they were competing with you. They were competing with you for food, for progeny, and so on and so forth, and all these things. So it's the job of society, modern society, and religion also, organized religion, to overcome this. But it's xenophobia is part of our DNA. And that's the burden that we all carry. Some of us are much better at overcoming it than others, but it's always there, way down deep, I believe.
I agree.
As an employee in the South, where I was always the only Jew, when something negative came about, I have to confess that I said, I wonder if they're picking on me because I'm Jewish. So you can multiply that by all kinds of times, if you're a person of color or a person of a religion like Islam or whatever. And so it's, but the point that I think it's so red hot now is because of the police and the victims. And, it's hard to move that aside. But I think if that were not the issue, I'd like to get to the broader solutions. And but right now we're even during this time where it just doesn't make sense that there are Black victims to police brutality, even though they're a small minority, that's red hot and it's political. So, which goes back to the first thing we talked about, how you pick judges. And I think one of the things that happened in our country is when we went to the primary system, instead of the backroom cigar-filled smoke system for picking candidates. I think the old way was better than the new way, because when you put political forces in charge of deciding who's an honest person, it gets too muddy. You just can't make good choices. So I think if there were studies done, I think you'd find the selection of judges where they're elected don't come out on top. And I'm just guessing. Anyway, that's just
Really interested. Shelley, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my father was born at the very end of 1913 in Arkansas, where not only was racism present, it was encouraged, because he would tell me how if Black people were coming the other way on the sidewalk, they'd have to step off the sidewalk, that they couldn't drink. I mean, you know about the water fountains in the schools. Yeah, so it was not only present, it was so encouraged that how could they not be prejudiced? That's how they were raised.
Yeah, it's true. It's a part of culture, and it's really, really hard to overcome. And I see this message in the chat as well from Judy Frankel. I see racism as tribalism. When push comes to shove, when we struggle to gain advantages over others, then race plays a part in defining the tribes. Race, social status, education, beliefs, and values can also divide us into tribes. And that definitely exists. Jonathan Haidt, I'm trying to remember the name of his book where I read this in, but he talks a lot about this, about how we make decisions based on the tribes or the groups that we feel we are a part of or that we wish to be a part of. And so that is a really interesting other element to it. I'm realizing the time, and I'm actually going to take us away from this text, although I think it is really important because I just want to bring us down a little bit. Okay, so let's look at the Sephardo text really quickly. The Torah addresses the judges who are charged with dispensing fair judgment, a warning not to relate sternly to one litigant while being lenient towards his opponent. Do not allow one to sit down while his opponent is required to remain standing upright, to treat people the same as one another. Excuse me. And Orah HaChaim speaks on something similar and saying, do not render an unfair decision in judgment. This warning is addressed to litigants who are not to try and secure a favorable judgment by ruses. If this were to happen, it would be considered avel, an injustice, a perversion of justice. This is the reason that the Torah addressed the prohibition in the plural form. You may understand this as follows. Avel b'mishpat, the justice would occur during judgment the judges handed down, seeing that the judge is obligated to arrive at his decision on the basis of the arguments presented by the litigants. This is also the reason that the commandment followed the directive not to place obstacles before the blind. Usually the reason that a judge arrives at a faulty decision is that someone deceived him. So that this can kind of relate to what we were talking about earlier, that sometimes racist or biased thoughts can masquerade as something that is for the good of everyone. And I think one of the examples of this is around voting rights in America, right? That it's like, oh, we need to preserve the vote and make sure that it's done fairly. And so what are we going to do? We're going to make it really, really hard for people who are minorities to get to the polls and have their votes counted.
That's not true.
Right. And we're going to carry that.
But the arguments that are made in such a way that it seems that it's something else. I want to bring in this other, because we already brought in this book, right? We brought in this book by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. Would anyone like to read these quotes right here?
I could do it.
Thank you, Shelley.
Slavery was not merely an unfortunate thing that happened to Black people. It was an American innovation, an American institution created by and for the benefit of the elites of the dominant caste and enforced by poorer members of the dominant caste who tried their lot to the caste system rather than to their consciences. Caste is an insidious and therefore powerful. Caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it is not hatred. It is not necessarily personal. It is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinkable expectations, patterns of a social order that have been in place for so long that looks like the natural order of things. That's exactly what I was talking about in Arkansas. Empathy is no substitute for the experience itself. We don't get to tell a person with a broken leg or a bullet wound that they're not in pain. And people who have hit the caste lottery are not in a position to tell a person who has suffered under the tyranny of caste what is offensive or hurtful or demeaning to those at the bottom. The price of privilege is the moral duty to act when one sees another person treated unfairly. And the least that a person in the dominant caste can do is not make the pain any worse.
I thought that was a really powerful statement.
It is.
Also based on a false premise. The American innovation, that is absolutely false.
Which false premise? I'm not sure what you're pointing to.
In the second sentence where it says it was an American innovation, does that not count the slavery that took place contemporarily in Latin America, for instance, and throughout Africa, even to this day?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many other examples of, and the caste system, the word comes from India.
It does, but it very much relates to what's going on in America.
It's not an American innovation.
No.
And we fought a war where 500,000 men died to eliminate it.
Right. Well, in its origin, I mean, I think we would have to actually go through the book and the arguments that she gives as to why she makes that statement, but we don't have the time to do that now. But regardless of whether or not we agree with that premise, I think that we can see that it's unfair that a person is treated as less than or treated with contempt simply because of who they are, because of the color of their skin, because of something that isn't controllable. And that perhaps we as human beings, especially as human beings who understand what it is to be targeted, have a responsibility to do all we can to make sure that no one else is targeted simply because of something that is skin deep. There's two final texts that I wanted to bring in here. And one is by Rabbeinu Bachya, who teaches, with righteousness you shall judge your fellow. This verse speaks about the fairness to be applied to the judicial process. Justice must not be preserved. It should be preserved. It should not be preserved. He who applies fair rules thereby strengthens the throne of the Almighty. It is said of God's throne that righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. If someone perverts the judicial system, he therefore undermines God's throne. This is a demeaning of God's glory. Midrash Tehillim phrases this thought with these words. If the judge judges righteously, the Shekhinah, or the presence of God, will be with him. We know this, as David said in Psalms, the Lord is present in the community of true judges. If the judge fails to apply these standards, the Shekhinah withdraws. So God is present when we judge without bias. That it actually is a sacred kind of thing. And the last verses I wanted to bring in are the two verses in our Torah portion that come directly after the one that we've been talking about this whole time, where it says, Lo tisna et achicha, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Eternal. And of course, the Holiness Code ends with these words, love your fellow as yourself, for I am the Eternal. And we can all ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to love another person the way that we love ourselves? And what can we do as individuals and communally in order to move towards this holy ideal? I'm going to stop share just so we can see one another. And as we come to the end of our class, are there any other reflections or thoughts that anyone would like to offer?
There was a lot here today that I thought sort of talks about the mandate for all of us Jews to behave, and you too, Jim, for all of us to behave in a holy manner. That all that was spoken about here, for me, had to do with behaving in a holy way, so that how I treat others, particularly those who don't look like me, who are Black or minorities, etc., the great responsibility I have to recognize that and to be active. And when I see wrong doing and terrible things happening to them, to speak out, to do something about it. Powerful, powerful lessons here.
And difficult, right?
Mhm.
Really
Yes.
difficult to be able to do this well.
You know, treating others in a way as if we would want to be treated also applies beyond race, but also to the disabled.
Yes.
And when I have seen people in wheelchairs or whatever in a public setting, or I'm walking on by, I try to, without being obnoxious, to say, hi, how are you? How's everything going? Or I would like to say it as often as I could, because those people feel less than whole, or they might feel because of their disability, be it accident, disease, or
Hi,
whatever.
Ben.
Yeah. I'd actually like to change the wording on that slightly, right?
Okay.
Someone who's in a wheelchair, someone who's dealing with a disability might be treated as if they're less than. They might have to deal with biases against them. They
Okay.
might not feel less than whole.
Okay,
But sometimes they're treated that
I
way.
agree. I agree with you. Yeah, you're right.
I knew you would. I just
Thank
wanted
you.
to kind of clarify
I
that.
I just said the wrong words. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I knew exactly what you meant, Michael. I
Okay.
understood your heart there.
Hi, Karen. It's Shelley. I screwed up your call.
But this text here, I applied it to race because of things that happened earlier this week. But it could be applied to any number of things, right? Right now, we have a DEI group that is working to really think through where might someone not be treated and not be fully accepted for the totality of who they are. And there are so many ways in which this could be applied. And yes, you are 100% right on that, Michael.
Thank you.
So I'm looking at the time, and I know there's so much to discuss here, but I wonder if we can conclude with some words of blessing. Marla, would you lead us?
I'm happy to. This is in Leviticus 19, verse 2, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And the blessing for us is on wholeness, WHOLENESS, wholeness. You are meant to be whole, to be true to your best self. You are meant to be holy, no matter what path your life has taken. Today, right now, you are called to the good, to walk the path of holiness. You are given this gift as your birthright, as one created in the image of the Holy One. Notice the presence of holiness at the core of each moment. Open your heart to the possibility of unasked for love, celebrating your essential being, kind and generous, giving and compassionate.
Thank you for those beautiful words.
Yeah, I like it.
And as we conclude today, I just want to say it's okay if we don't agree on every premise and every word that was spoken today. It's okay if we're a little bit in conflict on some of these ideas, because we need one another's voices, and we all have biases and we all have things to learn. And it's through discussing them and bringing them in that we can become more whole as a community. So I just want to thank you all for the wisdom and the insight that you brought in today. And I look forward to studying with you again next week in Torah study. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.